Chief Science Officer Do-Yum Kim stared out the large window of the spaceship Cheonsa. The dark planet below looked empty and cold. After 3 months of space travel, they had finally reached their destination. Do-Yum checked his tablet one more time. All the readings showed the planet was safe to explore. "Captain, the surface scans are complete," Do-Yum said into his communicator. "The air is breathable, and there are no dangerous gases. We can start our exploration whenever you're ready." Captain Sang-min's voice came back clear through the speaker. "Good work. Get your team ready. You have permission to land in 2 hours." Do-Yum walked through the bright white corridors of the ship to the science lab. Inside, Hae-Yun Park was already preparing their equipment. She was the ship's expert on strange and unexplained events. Many people had laughed when the company decided to send a paranormal researcher on a science mission. But Hae-Yun had proven herself useful many times before. "The robots have found something interesting," Hae-Yun said without looking up from her screen. "About 2 kilometers from our landing spot. It looks like old buildings." Do-Yum moved closer to look at her screen. The black and white images showed what looked like stone walls covered in strange marks. "Those symbols, they look familiar somehow." Hae-Yun nodded. "They do. I've seen similar patterns in very old books from Earth, books about ghosts and spirits." She paused. "But that's impossible. We're the first humans to ever come this far into space." 2 hours later, their small landing ship touched down on the planet's surface. The sky was a deep purple color, and 2 small moons hung low on the horizon. Do-Yum led the way, with Hae-Yun and 3 security officers following close behind. The walk to the ruins was quiet. Their boots left clear marks in the gray dust that covered everything. As they got closer to the buildings, Do-Yum felt a strange feeling in his stomach. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't say what. "The air temperature just dropped 5 degrees, one of the security officers said, checking his equipment. Hae-Yun pulled out her own device. "The energy readings are unusual. They keep changing, like something is moving around us." They reached the first building. Its walls were made of black stone that seemed to absorb their flashlight beams. The symbols they had seen in the pictures covered every surface. Some of them seemed to shine slightly in the dim light. "Look at this," Do-Yum called out. He was standing in front of what appeared to be an entrance. Inside, on a stone table, sat 3 objects. They looked like boxes made of the same black stone as the building, each covered in glowing symbols. Hae-Yun walked up next to him, her scanner beeping faster. "The energy readings are strongest here. These objects, they're putting out some kind of power we've never seen before." Do-Yum reached for one of the boxes. As his fingers touched the cold stone, all their lights flickered at once. A low humming sound filled the air. "Maybe we shouldn't," Hae-Yun started to say, but it was too late. The symbols on the box Do-Yum was holding began to glow bright blue. The humming grew louder, and the air around them grew even colder. In the distance, they heard something that sounded like whispers. "We need to get these back to the ship," Do-Yum said, carefully placing the box in his sample container. "Whatever they are, they're still working after all this time. This could be the biggest discovery in human history." As they packed up the artifacts, none of them noticed the shadows that seemed to move on their own. None of them saw the dark shapes that followed them back to their landing ship, and none of them realized that they had just started something that couldn't be stopped. Back on the Cheonsa, as Do-Yum logged his findings in the ship's computer, his coffee cup moved 3 centimeters to the left. He didn't notice this either. Not yet. Junior engineer Jai-Ho Lee liked working late at night. The ship was quiet then, and he could focus better. Tonight, he was checking the storage bay where they kept the strange black boxes from the planet. His job was to make sure the temperature stayed constant and the security cameras were working. The storage bay was cold, much colder than the rest of the ship. Jai-Ho pulled his jacket tighter and looked at the temperature control panel. The numbers kept changing. going up and down for no reason. He had fixed this system 3 times already, but it wouldn't stay fixed. Something's wrong with these readings, he said to himself, typing notes into his tablet. Then he heard a sound behind him, like metal scraping against metal. Jai-Ho turned around slowly. A wrench that had been on his tool bench was now in the middle of the floor. He was sure he hadn't moved it. He walked over and picked it up. It was ice cold. "Hello," he called out. "Is someone there?" The storage bay lights flickered in response. His tablet made a warning sound. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. Jai-Ho could see his breath now. He walked to the black boxes, which sat inside a special glass case. The symbols on them were glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Suddenly, all his tools lifted off the bench at once. They hung in the air for a moment, then crashed to the floor. Jai-Ho jumped back, his heart pounding. He reached for his communicator, but it wasn't working. Only static came through. He turned to run for the door, but stopped. There, on the wall, shadows were moving. They didn't look like normal shadows. They were too dark, too solid, and they were moving against the light. As he watched, one shadow seemed to reach out toward him. Jai-Ho ran. He didn't stop until he reached the ship's main corridor, where the lights were bright and other crew members were walking around. His hands were shaking as he pressed the emergency button on a wall panel. "Security, this is Junior Engineer Lee. There's something wrong in Storage Bay 3. Something impossible." Captain Sang-Min Cho was enjoying his morning coffee when Security Chief Min-Ho Kwon brought him the incident report. The captain read it twice, frowning. "Moving objects. Shadows that move on their own." He shook his head, checked the security footage. Min-Ho placed a tablet on the captain's desk and played the video. They watched as Jai-Ho worked in the storage bay. Then they saw it. Tools flying through the air, temperatures dropping, and strange dark shapes moving across the walls, all by themselves. "This has to be a malfunction," Captain Sang-Min said. But even as he spoke, his coffee cup began to slide across his desk. Both men watched, frozen in surprise, as the cup moved 10 centimeters to the right without anyone touching it. The cup stopped at the edge of the desk. For a long moment, neither man spoke. "Sir," Min-Ho finally said, "I think we need to talk to Ho-Yun Park. This is exactly the kind of thing she studies." The captain nodded slowly, still staring at his coffee cup. "Get her and Do-Yum Kim up here right away." And he paused. "Bring the security footage from all the other cameras near those artifacts. I want to know if anything else strange has been happening that we missed." As Min-Ho left the office, the lights flickered once, then went back to normal. In Storage Bay 3, the symbols on the black boxes pulsed brighter for a moment. And somewhere in the ship's walls, in the dark spaces between decks, something was waking up. Something that had waited a very, very long time to find new people to play with. Medical Officer Yu Jin Kang's morning started with 3 patients. All of them had the same strange marks on their arms, dark purple bruises that appeared overnight. None of them could explain how they got them. "It felt cold," said the first patient, a young technician. "Like someone grabbed my arm while I was sleeping, but when I woke up, no one was there." Yu Jin wrote everything down carefully. She had been a doctor for 15 years, but she had never seen bruises appear like this. As she examined the marks, the lights in her medical bay dimmed slightly, then returned to normal. "Dr. Kang," the ship's AI announced through the speakers, "you have an urgent message from Ho-Yun Park." Ho-Yun arrived at the medical bay 10 minutes later. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept well. "How many people have reported seeing shadows?" she asked without saying hello, or feeling cold spots, or hearing whispers. Yu Jin checked her records. 7 people this week, and now these bruises. She showed Ho-Yun the pictures she had taken. "What's happening on this ship?" Before Ho-Yun could answer, all the medical equipment started beeping at once. The temperature dropped quickly. Their breath came out as white clouds in the suddenly cold air. "It's here," Hye-Yun whispered. She pulled out a device that looked like a small tablet. "The energy readings are off the charts." A shadow moved across the wall behind them. It was darker than a normal shadow, and it moved like water flowing upward. Medical tools began to rattle in their drawers. A tray of bandages flew across the room. "Don't move," Hye-Yun said quietly. "It's trying to get our attention, just like the stories in the old books." The shadow on the wall grew larger. It seemed to take the shape of a person, but stretched and wrong. Cold air wrapped around them like invisible hands. Yoo-Jin's computer turned on by itself. Words appeared on the screen, one letter at a time. "We are HFY." "Hye-Yun," Yoo-Jin said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What are we dealing with?" "Something that's been waiting a long time," Hye-Yun answered. She held up her device, taking readings. "Those artifacts we found, they weren't just objects. They were prisons, and we let something out." The shadow moved closer. Medical books fell from shelves. The lights flickered faster now. More words appeared on the computer. "We remember the old world." Suddenly, the ship's main alarm started blaring. Captain Sang-min's voice came through the speakers. "All crew members, report to your emergency stations immediately. This is not a drill." The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had come. The temperature returned to normal. But the words on the computer screen remained. Hye-Yun touched her communicator. "Do-Young, are you seeing this?" The energy patterns matched the old Earth texts exactly. "These aren't random events. They're trying to communicate." Do-Young's voice came back through static. "The ship's AI is picking up similar messages all over the ship. And the artifacts, they're glowing brighter than ever. We need to figure out what they want before things get worse." Yoo-Jin looked at her medical records again. More patients were arriving with unexplained injuries and stories of strange dreams. In these dreams, they all saw the same thing. A world covered in darkness, where shadows had power, and strange beings waited between dimensions for their chance to return. The ship's lights flickered one more time. In the medical bay computer, final words appeared. "The DOR is OPN now. We are coming home." Hye-Yun and Yoo-Jin watched the words fade away. They knew that whatever had been locked away in those black boxes was now free, and it was getting stronger every hour. Communications officer Ta-Hee Choi sat in her quiet office, surrounded by screens showing ship data. For 3 days, she had been studying every strange event on the Chianza. She knew there had to be a pattern. There was always a pattern, if you looked hard enough. Her computer showed a map of the ship. Red dots marked where things had moved by themselves. Blue dots showed where people had seen shadows. Yellow dots marked the cold spots. At first, the dots looked random. But slowly, as she watched, something became clear. "Captain," she called through her communicator. "I found something. You need to see this." Captain Sang-min arrived quickly, followed by Hye-Yun Park. Ta-Hee pointed to her main screen. "Look at how the events move through the ship. They're not random. They're making shapes." She pressed a button, and lines appeared between the dots. The lines formed clear patterns, circles and triangles, over and over. "These patterns," Hye-Yun said, leaning closer, "they match old symbols for doorways. Doorways between worlds." She pulled out an old book from her bag. The same patterns were drawn on its pages. Suddenly, all the screens in the office went black. When they came back on, each one showed the same message. "UUND or STND now." The temperature dropped. Ta-Hee's coffee cup slid across her desk and crashed to the floor. Papers flew into the air, arranging themselves on the wall in the same patterns they had seen on the screens. "They're trying to tell us something," Ta-Hee said. Her voice was calm, even though her hands were shaking. "Every time they move something, every cold spot, every shadow, it's all part of a message." The ship's AI spoke through the speakers. Warning. Unknown energy patterns detected in multiple sections. Power fluctuations in all systems. Hei-yun pulled out her scanning device. The energy readings are stronger now. Whatever these beings are, they're getting better at affecting our world. They're learning. Captain Sang-min watched as more papers flew up to the wall, forming new patterns. Can you decode their message? He asked Tahi. What are they trying to tell us? Tahi studied the patterns carefully. I think they're showing us a map. Not of the ship, but of space itself. See these repeating triangles? They look like the star patterns near that planet where we found the artifacts. More words appeared on the screens. The old paths still exist. We is HFY. The lights flickered again, and a new pattern formed on the wall. This one was bigger, more complex. It showed lines connecting different stars, forming a web of paths through space. It's a network, Hei-yun whispered. The ancient beings didn't just travel through space like we do. They moved between dimensions, using these paths like shortcuts. The temperature dropped even more. Frost formed on the windows. The shadow shapes they had seen before appeared on the walls, moving between the paper patterns. We teujichi your ANC stores, the screen showed. Now, we teacu. Tahi quickly saved all the patterns to her computer. She knew that understanding these messages might be their only chance to control what was happening. But as she worked, she couldn't help wondering, were these beings really trying to teach them something, or were they being led into a trap? Outside her office, in the dark corridors of the ship, more shadows gathered. They were no longer hiding. They were preparing. Hei-yun Park sat in the ship's library, surrounded by old books and computer screens. She had been reading for hours, comparing the ship's logs with ancient texts from Earth. As she read, the pieces started coming together, forming a picture that made her blood run cold. Do-young Kim found her there, still reading. You missed the morning meeting, he said. Did you find something? Hei-yun looked up, her face pale. I know what the artifacts are, she said quietly. They're not just boxes, they're doors. And we didn't just find them, they wanted us to find them. She pointed to one of the screens, which showed the latest power readings from the artifacts. Next to it was an old book, open to a page about spirit doors. The patterns were exactly the same. Look at this, she said, touching the screen. Every ghost story from Earth's past, every tale about spirits and moving objects. They weren't just stories. They were warnings. These beings have been trying to reach our world for thousands of years. Do-young sat down, looking at the data. But why now? Why our ship? Before Hei-yun could answer, all the screens in the library changed. They showed the same strange patterns Tahi had discovered. But now the patterns were moving, shifting like living things. The quantum drive, Hei-yun whispered, suddenly understanding. Our ship's engine. It creates small tears in space to help us travel faster. These beings, they'd been waiting for humans to develop this technology. The library grew cold. Books began to fall from shelves, their pages opening to show more patterns, more warnings. The shadows on the walls grew darker, more solid. They needed a power source strong enough to open their doorways completely. Hei-yun continued. Our quantum drive gave them exactly what they needed. Every time we use it, we make it easier for them to cross over. Do-young's tablet turned on by itself. Words appeared. She-UNDERS TANDs. Fine ALI. More shadows gathered around them. They could hear whispers now, voices speaking in languages that hadn't been heard on Earth for thousands of years. Hei-yun opened another book, her hands shaking. The ancient temples, the stone circles, the places people said were haunted. They were all doorways, but they were never strong enough. Until now. The ship's AI spoke through the speakers. Warning. Quantum drive energy levels increasing without authorization. Unknown power signatures detected throughout the ship. Do Young tried to use his communicator to call the engine room, but it only produced static. "We need to warn the captain," he said, "if they're using our drive somehow." "It's too late," Heyun interrupted. "They're already here. They've been here since we found the artifacts. Everything that's happened, the moving objects, the shadows, the patterns, it was all just practice. They were learning how to use our technology, our energy." The lights went out completely. In the darkness, they could see the shadows taking shape, becoming more solid. The temperature dropped so low, they could see their breath. All the screens lit up at once, showing one final message. "The DDORs are EOPN. The old ones return." In the engine room, far below them, the quantum drive began to pulse with a strange dark energy. The doorway between worlds was opening, and there was no way to close it. Not anymore. Security Chief Min-Ho Kwon stood in the ship's main control room, watching his team set up the new equipment. Captain Sang-min had given him one task: find a way to fight back against the shadows. After 3 days of research, they had found something interesting. "The frequency generators are ready," one of his officers reported. "We've placed them in all the main corridors, just like Heyun suggested." Min-Ho nodded, checking the control panel. The generators would create special electromagnetic waves. According to Heyun's research, these waves were similar to the effects of iron and salt in old Earth stories about ghosts. The ancient people hadn't understood the science, but they had found ways to protect themselves. "Start the test," Min-Ho ordered. "Maximum power." The generators hummed to life. Blue lights flickered along the corridors as waves of electromagnetic energy filled the ship. For a moment, nothing happened. Then they heard it, a high-pitched sound like many voices screaming from far away. The shadows that had been gathering in the corners suddenly pulled back. The temperature, which had been freezing, began to rise. On the security screens, Min-Ho could see the dark shapes retreating from the generator's range. "It's working," he said into his communicator. "Captain, the shadows are falling back. The frequency is hurting them somehow." But their victory was short-lived. As they watched, the shadows began to change. They merged together, forming larger, darker shapes. The temperature dropped again, faster than before. One of the generators sparked and went dead. "They're adapting." Heyun's voice came through the communicator. "They're learning how to block the frequencies. We need to change the pattern before." Her voice cut off as all the generators failed at once. The lights went out across the ship. In the darkness, Min-Ho could see the shadows moving closer. They were different now, more solid, more purposeful. "Everyone out," he ordered. "Fall back to the emergency control room. Now." His team ran, but the shadows were faster. 2 officers were caught in the darkness. When emergency lights came on a few seconds later, the officers were gone. There was no trace of them anywhere on the ship. In the emergency control room, Captain Sang-min waited with Heyun and Do-Young. They had turned this room into their last defense point, using every type of energy field they could create. "The generators failed," Min-Ho reported. "And we lost Park and Lee. Just gone." The captain's face was grim. "We're running out of options. These beings are too strong, too adaptable. Every time we find a way to fight them, they change their tactics." "Not every time," Heyun said suddenly. She was looking at her readings. "There's a pattern to how they adapt. They can only change in certain ways. If we can predict their next change." The ship shuddered. On the monitors, they could see the quantum drive's energy levels rising dangerously high. The shadows were gathering around the engine room, drawing power from the drive. "We don't have much time," Do-Young warned. "At this rate, they'll have enough energy to open all their doorways in less than 6 hours. After that." He didn't need to finish. They all knew what would happen. The beings that had been trapped between dimensions for thousands of years would break through completely, and humanity would face an enemy it had only known through ghost stories and nightmares. Minho checked his weapons, even though he knew they were useless against shadows. "What's our next move, Captain?" Captain Sangmin looked at each of them. "We have 6 hours to save not just our ship, but maybe our entire world. Let's make them count." Junior Engineer Jai-Ho Lee stood in front of the quantum drive's main control panel. His hands moved quickly over the buttons as he checked the readings again. What he saw made his heart sink. "The drive is running at 200% power," he reported to his communicator. "The shadows are using it like a giant door opener. I've never seen energy readings this high." In the emergency control room, Captain Sangmin and the others listened to Jai-Ho's report. The screens around them showed the shadow beings growing stronger every minute. Dark shapes moved through the ship's walls as if they weren't there. "How long until the doorway is fully open?" the captain asked. "Less than 2 hours," Jai-Ho answered. "After that, there's no stopping them. They'll be able to reach any part of space where humans use quantum drives. Every ship, every space station, nowhere will be safe." Hae-Yun Park stepped forward. She had been very quiet for the last hour, reading something on her tablet. "There might be a way," she said softly, "but the cost will be very high." Everyone turned to look at her. The emergency lights made their faces look pale and tired. "The quantum drive isn't just powering their doorway," Hae-Yun explained. "It's becoming part of it. If we destroy the drive while they're connected to it, we could trap them between dimensions again." Do-Yum finished, understanding her idea. "But without the quantum drive, we'll be stranded," Captain Sangmin said. "Regular engines would take us 40 years to reach the nearest human colony." The ship shuddered. More warning lights flashed on the control panels. The shadow beings were getting closer to the emergency room's defenses. "There's something else," Hae-Yun said. "The drive can't be destroyed by computer. Someone has to go to the engine room and do it manually. And," she paused, "someone has to stay behind to keep the shadows busy, to make them think we're trying something else." Heavy silence filled the room. They all knew what she was saying. Whoever went to destroy the drive would face the strongest shadow beings, and whoever stayed to distract them would never make it back. "I'll do it," Jai-Ho said through the communicator. "I know the drive better than anyone. I can set it to overload. And I'll be the distraction," Hae-Yun said quietly. "I understand them better than anyone else. I can keep their attention." Captain Sangmin started to protest, but Hae-Yun held up her hand. "We don't have time to argue. The whole human race depends on this working." The captain looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Everyone else, get to the escape pods. We'll need to launch as soon as the drive starts to overload." Hae-Yun gathered her research materials and her scanning equipment. "I'll head to the storage bay. That's where the artifacts are strongest. They'll sense the energy and follow me there." Before she left, Do-Yum caught her arm. "There has to be another way." Hae-Yun smiled sadly. "Sometimes the only way to fight monsters is to be willing to sacrifice everything to stop them." She turned to go, then looked back one last time. "Make sure everyone knows what really happened here. Make sure they understand what we found out here in deep space." As Hae-Yun walked toward the storage bay, she could feel the shadows gathering. The temperature dropped around her. Dark shapes moved in her path. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had a job to do, and she would make it count. 3 days after the quantum drive exploded, the Chianza floated quietly in deep space. The regular engines hummed softly, pushing the ship forward at a much slower speed. In the main control room, Captain Sangmin looked at the damage reports on his screen. "Play the final recording again," he said to the ship's eye. The screen showed the engine room from 3 days ago. Jai-Ho stood at the drive controls, working quickly. Behind him, dark shapes moved through the walls. The temperature indicator showed numbers far below freezing. In another window, Hae-Yun appeared. She was in the storage bay, surrounded by the glowing artifacts. Shadows swirled around her as she read from her old books, keeping the being's attention focused on her. "Drive overload in 30 seconds. Jai-Ho's voice said through static. "Captain, I hope you're far enough away by now." The recording showed Jai-Ho pressing the final buttons. The quantum drive's light grew brighter and brighter. The shadows realized what was happening too late. They rushed toward the engine room, their shapes becoming darker and more solid. Then the screen went white. When the picture returned, the engine room was empty. The shadows were gone. And so were Jai-Ho and Hae-Yun. Captain Sang-min turned off the recording. His crew had escaped in the pods, then returned to the ship after the explosion. They had searched for hours, but found no trace of Jai-Ho or Hae-Yun. The only things left in the storage bay were the 3 black boxes, now cold and silent. Do-Young entered the control room, carrying his tablet. "The containment unit is ready," he reported. "We've put the artifacts inside. They're surrounded by every type of shield and energy field we could create. And the warning beacon, launched an hour ago, it will tell every human ship what we found out here, and what it cost us to stop it." The captain nodded. He looked out the window at the stars. Without the quantum drive, their journey home would take decades, but they had saved much more than just themselves. "The beams are not gone forever," Do-Young said quietly. "They're trapped between dimensions again, but someday they might find another way back." The captain finished. "That's why we need to make sure everyone knows the truth. The old stories weren't just stories. The warnings weren't just superstition." In his quarters that night, Do-Young wrote in the ship's official log. He recorded everything that had happened, everything they had learned. He wrote about the ancient beings who had waited so long to return, about the doorways between worlds, about the true meaning of humanity's ghost stories. Most importantly, he wrote about Hae-Yun Park and Ji-Ho Lee, about their courage, their sacrifice. Future generations would need to remember them, would need to understand what they had done. The Chianza continued its long journey home through space. In the containment unit, the 3 black boxes sat in darkness. Their symbols no longer glowed, but sometimes, late at night, the ship's sensors would detect a faint energy reading from them. A reminder that some doors were meant to stay closed, that some stories were meant to be warnings. And in the space between dimensions, in the darkness between worlds, something waited and remembered. The doorway had been closed, but there would be other ships, other quantum drives, other chances. The war wasn't over, it had only just begun.